Bible study. Today we are reading Jonah chapter 1 verses 4 through 8. Let's read these 4 verses together. Verse 4 says, "But the Lord threw a great wind onto the sea, and such a great storm arose on the sea that the ship threatened to break apart. The sailors were afraid, and each cried out to his God. They threw the ship's cargo into the sea to lighten the load. Meanwhile, Jonah had gone down to the lowest part of the vessel and had stretched out to fall and fallen asleep into a deep sleep. The captain approached him and said, 'What are you doing sound asleep? Get up, call to your God. Maybe this God will consider us and we won't perish.' 'Come on,' the sailors said to each other. 'Let's cast lots. Then we will know who is to blame for this trouble that we are in.' So they cast lots, and the lot singled out Jonah. They said to him, 'Tell us, who is to blame for this trouble we are in? What is your business, and where are you from? What is your country, and what people are you from?' Last week we saw how God called Jonah to preach against the evil ways in the great city of Nineveh. Instead of answering God's calling, Jonah flees to Tarsus away from the presence of God. Today we learn how God cast a great storm upon the boat carrying Jonah due to his sin of disobeying the Lord's instructions. So how does God use this great storm that we just read about in accomplishing his mission? When storm rises in our lives, it is often a result to our sin. However, that is not always the case. An example of this would be the life of Job. The one thing that we often don't realize is that our sin affects others around us. As we see in this passage of scripture, Jonah's sin affected the lives of these Gentile sailors who were caught up in this storm too. However, as we will see later in this chapter, these Gentile sailors will eventually come into genuine faith in the one and true God. As pastor and author Tim Keller says, "When storm comes into our lives, whether as consequences or of our wrongdoing or not, Christians have the promise that God will use them for their good." This storm served as a wake-up call for Jonah, letting him know who is really in control. If you look down at verse 4, you see how this narrative shifts from Jonah's behavior from verse 3 to the Lord's response here in verse 4. Whereas Jonah feared going to the great city of Nineveh, the Lord caused a great windstorm to occur. Jonah attempted to hide from the presence of God by fleeing, but soon learned that that is impossible to do. Now, jumping down to verse 5, you see how these pagan sailors aboard this boat feared the storm. These pagan sailors were so afraid that they cried out to their gods for help. And out of desperation, they began to throw the ship's cargo to help lighten the load. Some scholars argue that this could also mean that the sailors threw the ship's cargo as a way to make an offering to their gods to appease the storm. But the offering was not enough. As we will see later in verse 15, they ultimately ended up throwing Jonah overboard into the raging storm, thus resulting in calming the sea. As we will see in verse 14, these sailors will soon cry out to Yahweh for help. As Jonah is sound asleep at the bottom of the boat, the ship's captain wakes him up. The words the captain tells Jonah echoes the words that Yahweh has spoken to him earlier, which were, "Arise and call." This verse reminds me of a time when I was a kid that my mom would often tell me to perform a particular task, whether that was cleaning my room or doing my homework. However, being the rebellious kid that I would oftentimes disobey her requests by playing a video game or watching TV instead. As I did those other things, I began to feel guilty because I could hear the very words of my mom's requests echoing throughout my mind that I would eventually do the very thing that she had told me at the beginning. And this is how I imagine Jonah felt hearing the captain telling him to get up and call out to his God for help. So as we continue throughout our study in chapter 1, we will see how these pagan sailors feared progressed. First, they feared the storm in verse 5, and then they feared a great fear in verse 10. And then they ultimately feared the one who caused this storm to happen in fearing Yahweh in verse 16. These pagan Gentile sailors will eventually become Yahweh fearers. So the question that we need to ask is this: is God only the God to Israel, or is he the God to the nations as well? So up to this point in the Old Testament, we see how God redeems and restores the people of Israel. But now we see something that is completely different that we have never read about before. Thank you for joining me on this episode of 5 Minute Bible Study, and I hope that you will join me next week as we continue through our study in Jonah.